Robin Williams walked onto The Tonight Show stage as the fastest, funniest man alive. A human hurricane who could not stop talking, could not stop moving, could not stop making the entire world laugh. But 4 minutes into the interview, Robin Williams did something nobody in that studio had ever seen him do. He went completely silent. Not for a beat, not for a punchline, for 4 full minutes. And the reason behind that silence was a secret Robin had been hiding behind every single laugh. A secret that made Johnny, Carson, reach across his desk and do something he had never done in 30 years of hosting. You will not believe what happens next. But before starting our video, I'd like to say something. I often see comments from people who did not realize they were not subscribed. If you enjoy the channel, please take a second to check and make sure you are subscribed. It is free, and it really helps us keep the show growing. Thank you for being part of this journey with us. It was October of 1982. The Tonight Show studio at NBC Burbank was already vibrating before Robin Williams ever stepped out from behind that curtain, because everyone in that building knew what was coming. Mork and Mindy had turned this 31-year-old comedian into the most explosive presence on American television. He didn't tell jokes, he detonated them. He could become 40 different characters in 60 seconds. A Russian cab driver, a Shakespearean king, a televangelist, a confused alien from the planet Orc, switching voices so fast that the studio crew sometimes forgot to laugh, because they were too busy trying to keep up. The producers loved booking him, because Robin Williams did not need a script. Robin Williams was the script. Hand him a microphone, point a camera at him, and the man would not stop until somebody physically pulled him off stage. So when Ed McMahon's voice boomed across the studio that night, ladies and gentlemen, the one, the only, Robin Williams. The 300 people in that audience rose to their feet before he was even visible. They were ready for the storm. What they were not ready for was the silence that came after it. Because what nobody in that studio knew, not the audience, not Ed McMahon, not the crew, not even Johnny Carson himself, was that Robin Williams had arrived at the studio that night carrying something he had never carried before. And in about 4 minutes, it was going to come out on live national television in a way that would stop 25 million Americans cold. Let me take you backstage to the 40 minutes before Robin Williams ever stepped in front of a camera that night, because that is where this story really begins. He arrived early, far too early. The stage manager, a woman named Patricia Vaughn, who had worked The Tonight Show for 9 years and had seen every kind of celebrity arrival there was, noticed it immediately, because Robin Williams was never early. Robin arrived in a blur, usually minutes before his cue, already mid-conversation with 3 people at once, leaving a trail of laughter behind him like exhaust. But that night he came in quiet. He came in early, and he sat in the green room by himself with the door half open, not talking to anyone, staring at a spot on the carpet. A young production assistant brought him a cup of coffee. Robin thanked her, and the assistant said later that what unsettled her was not that he seemed sad. It was that he seemed switched off. It was like watching an engine idle, she said. All that horsepower just sitting there with nowhere to go. She asked if he was all right, and Robin Williams looked up at her and gave her a smile so warm and so reassuring that she walked away completely convinced he was fine. That was the thing about Robin. The smile was real, and the reassurance was real, and underneath both of them was something neither of them touched. He could make you feel better about him while he was falling apart. It was the most dangerous talent he had. What that production assistant didn't know, what nobody backstage knew, was that 2 nights earlier, Robin Williams had been sitting alone in his apartment at 3 in the morning, in a darkness he had never been able to describe to a single living soul, and the only thing that had pulled him through that night was an old rerun on the television. We'll get to that. But hold on to it, because it is the key that unlocks everything. Here is something else that happened in that green room, something that didn't come out until years later, when one of the writers finally told the story. About 10 minutes before the show, one of the staff writers poked his head in to run a couple of quick topic ideas past Robin, the usual pre-show ritual. Here are the things Johnny might ask. Here's a setup you might want to have ready. And, normally, Robin would have taken those 3 topics and spun them into 9. Riffing so fast the writer would be scribbling to keep up, building bits on the spot that were funnier than anything anyone had prepared. That was the joy of working with him. But that night, Robin just listened and nodded and said, yeah, that's good, thanks. And the writer stood there for a second, waiting for the explosion of ideas that always came, and it didn't come. He left the room a little confused and told a colleague in the hallway, "Something's off with Robin tonight. I can't put my finger on it. He's being polite." And the colleague laughed and said, "Robin Williams, polite? Now I've heard everything." Neither of them understood that politeness from a man like that on a night like that was the loudest alarm bell in the building. They just didn't know how to hear it. Almost nobody does. For now, just know this. When Robin Williams stood up in that green room and heard Ed McMahon say his name, he took a breath and he reached down inside himself and turned the engine over, and the horsepower roared to life. And the quiet man in the green room vanished, and out from behind that curtain came the hurricane America was waiting for. But the quiet man was still in there, and he was about to come out on live television whether Robin wanted him to or not. Robin exploded onto the stage. He didn't walk. He never walked. He came out sideways, mid-impression, already doing a bit about the traffic on the way to the studio, already 3 jokes deep before he reached the desk. He shook Johnny's hand, then kept shaking it, then pretended his arm was stuck, then shook it as the Queen of England, then as a malfunctioning robot. The audience was screaming. Johnny was laughing that genuine Carson laugh, the one that made his whole face crinkle, the one he could not fake even after 30 years. Robin sat down. He stood back up. He sat on the arm of the chair. He grabbed a coffee mug off Johnny's desk and started doing a monologue as the mug. It was perfect. It was the Robin Williams everybody knew and loved. And then, and this is the part nobody could explain for years, somewhere around the 4-minute mark, Robin Williams stopped. Mid-sentence, he had been doing a rapid-fire bit, a character voice trailing off, and he just stopped. His hand, which had been carving the air 100 miles an hour, slowly came down and rested on his knee. The manic light in his eyes flickered. And for the first time that night, for the first time anyone in that audience had ever seen on television, Robin Williams' face went still. The audience laughed at first. They thought it was a setup. They thought the silence was the joke, that any second now he would snap back into a character, and the punchline would land, and the room would explode again. That was Robin's genius. After all, the unexpected pause before the kill. The longer the pause, the bigger the laugh. So they waited for it. They leaned in, grinning ready. But the pause kept going. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. The laughter died down into confused murmuring. People started glancing at each other. Was this part of the act? Was something wrong with the equipment? Had he forgotten where he was? In the control room, the director leaned toward his monitor and muttered, "What is he doing?" He turned to his technical director. "Is his mic live?" "Check his mic." The mic was live. There was nothing wrong with the equipment. There was nothing wrong with anything anybody could point to. There was only a man sitting in a chair on the most watched program in America. And for the first time in his public life, he had stopped. Ed McMahon's smile froze on his face. Ed had sat to Johnny's left for 2 decades. He knew the rhythm of that stage better than his own heartbeat. He knew when a guest was bombing and needed a save. He knew when a bit was building and needed room. He knew the difference between every kind of silence a stage could hold. And this silence did not match any of them. This was not comic timing. Ed shifted in his chair, half rising, ready to do something, anything, though he had no idea what. And Johnny Carson, the most perceptive man in the history of late-night television, a man who had read 1,000 guests across 1,000 desks, a man who could tell within 10 seconds of a handshake whether someone was nervous or arrogant or grieving or lying, Johnny Carson did not try to fill the silence with a joke. He did not throw to Ed. He did not reach for the safety net of a commercial break. He just watched, because Johnny was looking at Robin's eyes, and Johnny saw something in them that made his own smile fade. Wait, do not miss this detail. Because what Johnny Carson saw in Robin Williams' eyes in that moment was the exact same thing Johnny had seen decades earlier in his own bathroom mirror at 3 in the morning. And he was about to do something about it on live television that no host had ever dared to do. Johnny leaned forward. He put one hand flat on the desk, and in a voice that was lower, softer, completely different from the broadcast voice America knew, he said, "Robin, where'd you go just now?" The studio went absolutely still. Robin Williams looked up at Johnny. And the thing about that look, the camera operator, a man named Gerald Pratt, who had filmed Robin during his first appearance and a dozen times since. Gerald said afterward that in all those tapings, he had never once seen Robin's face without motion in it. There was always a twitch, a flicker, a character trying to climb out. But in that moment, the face was just a man's face, tired, 40 years older than 31. And Robin Williams said 4 words that landed in that studio like a stone dropped into still water. "I'm so tired, Johnny." The audience didn't laugh. Some of them didn't even breathe. Because the way he said it, there was no setup, no wink, no character waiting in the wings. It was just true. And truth, when it shows up uninvited on a comedy stage, has a weight that everyone in the room can feel. But here is what makes this story extraordinary. Because what Robin said next, and what Johnny did in response, would reveal a secret that connected these two men in a way nobody could have imagined. Johnny did not cut to commercial. The director was practically begging in his ear, "Johnny, we can break right now." But Johnny reached up and pressed his hand against his earpiece and gave the smallest shake of his head. "No, we are not breaking. Let it happen." "Tired of what?" Johnny asked gently. And Robin Williams, sitting in the chair where he had spent years being the funniest man any of these people had ever seen, began quietly to tell the truth. "Of being on," he said, "of being this." He gestured vaguely at himself, at the whole machine of it. "You know what it's like, Johnny? It's like there's a guy in here who does all of this. The voices, the bits, the running, and he's great. People love him. He's the best friend in the world for about 90 minutes a night. And then everybody goes home." He paused. "And the guy stays on. He doesn't have an off switch. I go home and there's nobody there to be funny for. And he's still going. 3 in the morning, doing voices in an empty apartment because if he stops..." Robin stopped. "If he stops," Johnny said softly, "then what's left?" Robin looked at him, and the smallest, saddest smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Yeah," he said, "then what's left?" He was quiet for a moment. "You want to know the worst part?" he said. "The worst part is that I'm good at it. If I were bad at it, somebody might have noticed. But I'm so good at making people laugh that the better I get, the more invisible the rest of me becomes. Nobody worries about the guy who's killing. You only check on the ones who are struggling out there. And I never struggle out there. Out there I'm bulletproof. It's in here." He touched his own chest, where the bullets land. "And there's no audience in here to see it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he went on, and his voice was steadier now. The way a voice gets steady when a person has decided to stop hiding, and the relief of it has become almost physical. "Everybody thinks the funny is the easy part, like it just pours out of me. And it does. That's the strange thing, it really does just pour out. But nobody asks why. Nobody asks what it's covering. You ever build a fire so big and so bright that nobody can see the house behind it is dark?" He looked at his hands. "I've been the brightest fire in every room I've walked into since I was a kid. And I figured out real young that if I was funny enough, fast enough, loud enough, then nobody would ever get close enough to ask how I was actually doing. The laugh is a wall, Johnny. The best wall ever built. People think you're letting them in when you make them laugh. You're not. You're keeping them out. You're keeping them at exactly arm's length, the distance of a punchline, forever. You could have heard a pin drop in that studio. 25 million people across America had leaned closer to their television sets. In living rooms from Maine to California, families who had turned on The Tonight Show to laugh themselves to sleep were now sitting in complete silence, watching the funniest man in the country tell them something that felt less like a confession and more like a window. A window into a room a lot of them recognized. And here is what almost nobody understood until this very night. The man who made the whole world feel less alone had, himself, never felt more alone in his life. The very thing that connected him to millions was the thing that walled him off from everyone. Every laugh he gave away was a brick in the wall, and he had built that wall so high and so beautifully that he had finally trapped himself behind it, and he did not know how to get out. But somebody was about to show him a door, and it was the last person in the world he expected. But what happened next shocked everyone in that studio. Because Johnny Carson, the king of late night, the man who guarded his private life like a fortress, the man who let absolutely nobody behind the curtain, Johnny Carson set down his pencil. He folded his hands, and he said, "Can I tell you something I've never said on this show?" Robin nodded. "There was a stretch," Johnny said, "years ago now when I was where you are. When I'd finish a show, a great show, the audience on their feet, and I'd walk back to my dressing room and close the door and feel like the loneliest man in America. Because out there, for an hour I was somebody, I was the guy. And the second the lights went down, I was just a man in an empty room who didn't know how to be a man in an empty room." Johnny's voice was quiet even. "People used to tell me I was the most relaxed man on television, the most natural, like I was born behind that desk. And the truth is the desk was the only place on earth I knew exactly who I was supposed to be. Out here I had a script, I had marks, I had a job. Off the air, I had a house full of rooms I didn't know how to be in, and a family I didn't know how to talk to, and a head that wouldn't get quiet. I had 3 marriages teaching me that lesson before I started to listen. 3. You'd think a man would catch on faster than that. A small, rueful sound. But you don't catch on, do you? Because the fire's so bright. Because everybody keeps clapping. And the clapping is the loudest thing in the world, right up until you're alone. And then it's the quietest. So when you say there's a guy in there who can't turn off, Robin, I'm not asking you that question as a host. I'm asking it as somebody who knows the room you're describing. I've stood in it. I've slept in it. I furnished the place. The studio audience was hanging on every word. Several people were crying, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet kind, the kind where the tears just come. And you don't fight them, because something true is happening in front of you, and you don't want to interrupt it. A man in the 5th row had his arm around the stranger sitting next to him. 2 women near the front were holding hands. Nobody had told them to. It was just that the thing happening on that stage had reached out past the footlights and touched something in every single person in the room, the private room each of them carried, the one they thought only they lived in. And then Robin Williams said, the thing that Johnny had been waiting for, the thing that nobody watching had any idea was coming. "You know why I came on tonight?" Robin asked. "Tell me." "Because 2 nights ago I was in a bad way. A real bad way. The worst I've been." Robin's voice was steady, but his hands had started to tremble slightly on his knee. "And I couldn't sleep, so I had the TV on." "You ever do that? Leave it on just so there's a voice in the room? Just so it isn't only you in the dark and the guy who won't shut off?" Johnny nodded slowly. He knew exactly. "So I had it on. And it was a rerun of this show. You from years back. And you were interviewing some kid, some nobody, some young comedian doing his first spot on a show this size. And the kid bombed. Just died out there. The worst kind of death there is. The silent kind, where the audience isn't even mad. They're just embarrassed for you. And that's worse. That's so much worse." Robin's eyes were far away now, back in that apartment, back in front of that flickering screen. "And I'm watching this, and my heart is breaking for the kid, because I know that feeling. I've lived in that feeling, and I figured you'd do what everybody does. Cut the segment. Save the show. Move on to the next thing, because the show must go on, right? That's the whole religion of this business." Robin's voice caught, but you didn't. Instead of moving on, instead of saving the segment, you leaned over, you leaned across that desk, and you talked to him, on the air, in front of everybody. You told him every comedian worth a damn had nights exactly like the one he'd just had. You told him the bomb was the tuition you pay for the laugh. You made him feel like the bomb didn't matter, like he mattered more than the act. Robin swallowed hard, and I sat there at 3 in the morning, in the worst place I'd been in years. And I watched a man on a piece of tape decide that a human being mattered more than good television. And I thought, I need to be in a room with that guy. Not Johnny Carson, the host. That guy. The one who leaned over. Wait, do not miss this. Because what Robin Williams was describing, that old rerun, that unknown kid who bombed and got pulled back from the edge by a kind word, that kid was real. And Johnny Carson was about to realize exactly who it was. And the answer was going to turn this entire night inside out. Johnny's face changed. Something moved behind his eyes, a memory surfacing from a long way down. When was that taping? He asked slowly. I don't know. Old. Black and white wasn't far behind it. Why? And Johnny Carson sat back in his chair, and for a long moment he said nothing at all. Because Johnny remembered the night. He remembered the kid. A skinny, terrified young comic, barely out of his teens, who had walked out under those lights with everything he had, and watched it all fall on the floor. He remembered the booker in the wings, making the cut-it gesture, drawing a finger across his throat, wanting the kid out the side door before the show was even over, so they could pretend it never happened. And Johnny had looked at that kid's face, that gray, hollowed out, I have just made the worst mistake of my life face. And Johnny had done something the booker hated. He had pulled the kid over to the desk. He had talked to him, on the air, like a person. He had told him that every comedian who ever became anything had eaten a night exactly like this one. He had made the kid laugh, just once, just a little, at the end. And the kid had nodded and held it together and walked off. And Johnny had never known what happened to that young man. He had wondered, sometimes, the way you wonder about people who pass briefly through your life and leave a fingerprint on you that you can't quite explain. What was the kid's name? Johnny asked. Do you remember? Robin shook his head. No, why does it matter? Because, Johnny said, and his voice had gone thick. I think I do remember that night. I've thought about that kid for 15 years. I've wondered whether he was okay, whether he quit, whether that one bad night was the night he gave the whole thing up. He looked at Robin. You're telling me he turned out fine. You're telling me he became something. Robin didn't answer right away. And in that pause, Johnny did something the cameras caught, but nobody at home understood until the rest of the story came out. He reached up and pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose, the way a man does when he is trying to hold a door shut inside himself, and he said, almost to himself, you do this job for 30 years. Thousands of people in that chair. Thousands more out in those seats every single night. And you tell yourself it's just television. It's just a show. You go home, and you wonder if any of it ever mattered to anybody past 11:30. If it was ever anything more than noise to fall asleep to. He let his hand drop. And then one night a man sits down across from you and tells you that the noise you forgot you even made kept somebody alive. He shook his head slowly. Robin, I don't think you understand what you just handed me. I think I do, Robin said quietly, because it's the same thing you handed me. And here is the part of the story that producers would talk about for the rest of their careers, the moment the whole thing turned completely, irrevocably inside out. Because Robin Williams looked at Johnny Carson and very quietly he said, Johnny, I never told you this, but I was in that audience that night, the night you saved that kid. He took a breath. I was 18 years old. I'd snuck into a taping. I was nobody. I wasn't even a comedian yet. I was just a kid who wanted to be one and was too scared to ever try. And I watched you do that. I watched you take a guy who had just died the worst death a performer can die, and instead of throwing him away, you leaned over and you made him okay, and I thought, if that's what this can be, if comedy can be that, then I want it. You didn't save that kid on the stage tonight, Johnny. You saved the one in the 3rd row. You saved me. 18 years old, watching you decide that a human being mattered more than a good segment. That's the night I decided to do this with my life. The studio gasped. Johnny Carson put his hand over his mouth. For 30 years, Johnny Carson had told himself a private thing every single night before he walked out, from behind that curtain. He had said it to himself so many times it had become a kind of prayer. You don't know who's watching. You don't know what they need. And here, sitting 3 feet away from him, was the living proof of it. A man who had become one of the greatest comedians America would ever produce, sitting in his chair, telling him that it all started in the 3rd row of this very studio, on a night Johnny had completely forgotten, Because of a kindness Johnny didn't even remember performing. I had no idea, Johnny said. His eyes were wet and he was not hiding it. All this time, you're telling me that all of this started because of one night out there in those seats. Started there, Robin said. And tonight, when I was in the worst place I've been in a long time, the place I told you about. I didn't go anywhere dark, Johnny. I came here. I came to the one room where I knew I'd be okay. Because the guy who leaned over 15 years ago, I figured he might still be willing to lean over. Robin's voice broke. And you did. The second I went quiet, you leaned over. And Johnny Carson did something then that he had never done in 3 decades of hosting The Tonight Show. He stood up from behind his desk. He walked around it, past the coffee mug, past the marks on the floor, past every rule of how the show was supposed to go. And he put his arms around Robin Williams. And the funniest man in America, who could not stop moving, who could not stop performing, who carried a guy inside him who never turned off. Robin Williams stopped and let himself be held. And for a moment there was no act at all. Just 2 men who had each, on different nights in this same room, been pulled back from the edge by the simple decision of another human being to pay attention. The studio rose to its feet, not the explosive ovation Robin had walked out to, something quieter and far bigger. People were crying openly now, all 300 of them, and Ed McMahon had turned away from the camera with his hand pressed to his eyes. And the director in the control room had stopped giving instructions entirely. Because there was nothing left to direct. The thing was directing itself. When they finally sat back down, Johnny looked at the camera. At the 25 million people he could not see but always spoke to like they were the only one in the room. I want to say something, Johnny said, and then we'll let Robin be funny again, because Lord knows the world needs him to be. A small laugh moved through the studio, but before that, somebody out there tonight is in the room Robin described. The empty one, the 3 in the morning one, the one where the guy who entertains everybody all day has nobody left to be okay for. And I want you to hear what just happened here. The funniest man in this country was in that room 2 nights ago. The funniest man. The one who makes everybody else feel better. He was in that room. So if you're in it too, you are not strange, and you are not weak, and you are not alone, and you are in extraordinary company. Reach toward somebody. Anybody. The way Robin reached toward an old TV rerun at 3 in the morning, it doesn't have to be the right person. It just has to be a person. Reach. We'll figure out the rest. Robin Williams looked at Johnny and said very softly, and if you don't know who to reach toward the guy who'll lean over. Then Robin smiled, a real one, and added, I'm fortunate enough to know mine is sitting right here. Took me 15 years and a really bad Tuesday to figure that out. And the laughter that came then was the kind that comes mixed with tears, the best kind there is. The Tonight Show ran 12 minutes over that night. NBC's switchboard lit up before the broadcast had even finished on the East Coast. By the next morning, the calls were still coming. Not from people complaining, but from people who needed to say that they had been in the empty room too, and that for the first time they had heard somebody name it out loud on national television, and that it had made the room feel a little less like a private prison, and a little more like a place a lot of people quietly lived. Crisis lines around the country reported a surge in calls in the days that followed. Not all of them from people in crisis, but from people who finally felt permission to say the thing out loud. What very few people know is what happened after the cameras finally stopped rolling. The audience filed out slowly, quietly, the way a congregation leaves a service rather than the way a crowd leaves a comedy show. And Robin Williams did not rush off. He sat at that desk with Johnny for almost an hour after the broadcast ended, the studio half dark, the crew giving them space. 2 men talking the way. 2 men talk when one of them has just put down something he'd been carrying for years and discovered, to his astonishment, that the floor held. Before Robin left, Johnny walked him all the way out to the parking lot, which Johnny famously never did, and the 2 of them stood under the lights for a while longer. Nobody knows exactly what was said out there, but the night watchman, a man named Earl who had worked NBC for 22 years, said he saw Johnny Carson write something on a card and press it into Robin Williams' hand before they parted. "Just a number," Earl said. Johnny told him. "Any night, any hour. The empty room calls, you call me first." And Robin folded that card and put it in his shirt pocket and patted it twice, the way you do with something you mean to keep. Robin Williams went on to give the world 4 more decades of joy. He won the hearts of children and adults across generations, became one of the most beloved performers who ever lived, and gave more of himself to make other people happy than almost anyone in the history of his craft. He never forgot that night. In a quiet interview years later, asked about the people who had shaped him most, he didn't name a director or a fellow comedian. He talked about a late-night host who, on a night Robin couldn't sleep, leaned over the desk and asked him where he had gone. And Johnny Carson, when he retired in 1992, was asked in a private interview which guest had stayed with him the most. Out of presidents, movie stars, every legend who ever sat in that chair, he named the night. A comedian went silent for 4 minutes. "He reminded me," Johnny said, "that the most important thing I ever did on that show was never a joke. It was leaning over. You spend 30 years thinking the job is making them laugh. And then somebody sits down and shows you the job was always something else underneath. It was making sure they didn't feel alone while they laughed." If this story moved you, do one thing before you close this video. Think of the person in your life who is always the funny one. The one who shows up and makes the whole room lighter. The one everybody leans on and nobody ever thinks to check on, because how could that person ever need checking on? They're always okay. They're always on. Call that person, not to be entertained, just to ask them, the way Johnny asked Robin, "Where did you go just now?" Because somewhere right now, somebody is the funniest person in their whole world. And they are sitting alone in the empty room, and they are waiting for one single human being to lean over. Be the one who leans over. You don't need a television studio. You don't need an audience. You just need to ask the question and then stay quiet long enough to hear the answer. Subscribe so you never miss these stories. Share this with someone who's always the funny one, the strong one, the one who's always fine. Because they might not be, and your message might be the rerun playing at 3 in the morning that pulls them back. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. Because this story is reaching people everywhere, and somewhere out there is somebody in the empty room who needs to know the whole world is leaning over for them tonight.